Good evening, everybody. My name is Bethy Atkins. I'd like to welcome you to Harvard Bookstore. Tonight, I'm very pleased to have Michael Bronski with us to discuss the book he co-authored with Kay Whitlock, Considering Hate: Violence, Goodness, and Justice in American Culture and Politics. Michael is professor of the practice in activism and media in the studies of women, gender, and sexuality at Harvard University, and is the author of several award-winning books, including A Queer History of the United States. He's been involved in gay liberation as a political organizer, writer, and editor for over 4 decades. Please join me in welcoming Michael Bronski.
Thank you all for coming. I must say that they always say that 4 decade thing. It makes me feel so old. And then Cornel West quote was like, we hardly even live up to it. I'm very pleased. I had cataract surgery in one eye a few months ago, so now I can actually read things that are not in 48-point type. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for Harvard Bookstore for hosting, and actually thank you for just being here. I want to thank my editor, Daugherty at Beacon Press. She's worked with me on 3 books, and worked with Kay and I on this book. And I want to have to thank Caitlin Mayer and Nicholas Cipriano, who are sitting over there, who are the publicists for the book. I want to talk just very briefly before I read a few words on the origin for the book. I met Kay Whitlock when I was editing her book, Queer Injustice: The Criminalization of LGBT People in the United States, for my Queer Nation series. She co-authored that with Joey Mogul and Andrea Ritchie. Kay has a very long history of social justice activism in a variety of areas: feminism, racial justice, LGBT rights, economic inequalities, and she's focused particularly on issues of prison and the death penalty and violence. In 2001, if you haven't read this, you should read it. She co-authored an extraordinarily influential paper called "In the Time of Broken Bones: A call to dialogue on hate violence and the limitations of hate crime legislation" for the American Friends Service Committee. And my own background, as we said, was in political organizing and journalism, mostly in LGBT areas. I sort of came to the college professor thing late in life. Actually, this is my first book that doesn't deal just with queer themes, although there's some queer content in it. Kay and I continued to talk about these issues about 2 years ago and decided to write these thoughts. We had a lot of thoughts about it into a small book. Even though it's small, it actually covers a lot of ground. We thought we could actually write a much longer book and take another 10 years to write 600 pages. But then we decided that brevity was more effective, and our model was sort of Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor, which is like only 120 pages and brilliant. Would I be Susan Sontag? Anyway, this costs much less than 600 pages. And frankly, most books can say what they need to say with many fewer pages, including many of my own books. So what I want to do now is I want to read 2 sections from Considering Hate. It's going to be thrilling to read without 48-point type. I think they give some of the larger concepts that we're dealing with here. And also, I'm happy to, obviously, to answer any questions. The really good thing about a short book is that you have to be really, really concise. This is much longer. We just kept editing it down. So I'm going to try to be as concise as possible with this. And read for maybe 20 minutes or so, and then take lots of questions. The book really generates lots and lots of questions. I can't see the glasses that are on the table. So we begin the introduction. Yeah, I can see this. No, it's actually amazing. We begin the introduction with one of my favorite quotes from Bertolt Brecht, which is from a play, The Caucasian Chalk Circle. And it's said by the narrator, and I think it's the crucial point for the entire play, but I think it's also possibly the crucial point for our book. And the quote is, "Terrible is the temptation to do good." And we begin the introduction. "In considering how central hate is to American discussions about violence and injustice, we wondered why the equally important concepts of goodness and justice were almost always missing. As we began to write about this absence, we realized that we needed definitions of these terms, our own definitions, and that would illuminate our thinking. So this is what we came up with. Goodness: an awareness translated into action of the intrinsic worth and interdependence of all people and ecologies, and the determination to dismantle societal structures that support social and psychic inequalities and the violence that accompanies them. Justice: the evolving pursuit of trustworthy, respectful, and non-exploitative relationships, together with their accountability for interrupting, preventing, and redressing violence in its myriad forms against individual peoples and communities. So it's a little bit dictionary-like, but I think it sort of sets the tone for the book. Hate haunts the human imagination. It is a primal response that engages an individual with the world. By establishing clear personal, social, and political boundaries, it allows us to situate ourselves as people and groups in larger, complex contexts. We feel hate, even revel in it, because it helps us separate good from evil, and therefore helps us survive. Because it is so emotionally charged, hate often makes us feel alive. We experience it as an anchor for safety, because it readily slots segments of the population into us and them. We know where we stand, with the good people who are hated by the bad people, or the good people who hate the bad people. Yet the safety we feel is inextricably bound to the anxiety that hate also generates. We know it can engender a counter-hate from people and groups we despise, thus placing us, arguably, in more danger than before. Tellingly, and this is actually from studies, tellingly, most people experience themselves not as haters, but as the hated. People are hesitant to claim the prerogative to hate without cause. However, once they feel that someone or some group hates them, they have no problem accessing their own hate. Hate is a language, not to be confused with hate speech, which is a political legal concept, that orders the world. People commonly think of hate as out of control, as an out of control, even obliterating emotion. Someone is consumed by hate, or eaten up by hate, as if its very existence eradicates the person experiencing it. This can be an intense personal experience. From time to time, people resort, quite often actually, from time to time, people resort to the language of hate. I hate you, to express a virulent rage felt towards individuals who have caused personal hurt. Or I hate that registers profound individual dislike of something as trivial as a particular food. Hate is also a political and social concept, which is what we're focusing on, that allows individuals and groups to negotiate a world that feels unsafe, which I think it does to many of us most of the time. Considering hate is about the ways in which the intense animus described as hatred is politically mobilized, and how hate as a political frame, the Kay's phrase that she's been using for decades, as a political frame shapes societal views about violence and the effective responses to it. Do all humans hate? If hate is employed to navigate danger, is it hardwired in human identity? The answer is unknowable. We can't extract human emotions from the cultural contexts in which they are named. What interests us here is how the concept of hate has evolved and how it functions today. The question is not so much why individuals and entire communities may have this feeling, but how they use it and how it constructs through language and symbols the material world and the human reaction in it. I've been teaching up in Hanover, New Hampshire, where it is so cold my throat is going to be dried out until June. But really, it was 24 below the other morning.
Oh my God.
Yes, it was very cold. I hated it. I really did. I really hated it. It made my scalp burn. Back to being serious. One of the most noted hate crimes, and we often put hate crimes in quotes, in recent U.S. history was the 1998 murder of Matthew Shepard. On October 7, 1998, Shepard, an openly gay 21-year-old middle-class white University of Wyoming student, was robbed and beaten to death by Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson, two methamphetamine-addicted, economically disadvantaged men his own age. The murder was immediately characterized as a hate crime, even though Wyoming's penal code had no such classification. There was no evidence, this is actually true, there's no evidence that Shepard was murdered because he was gay, although that may have played part in his being selected as a robbery victim. Labeling it as a hate crime, the media highlighted issues of anti-LGBT violence, and obviously very effectively. At the same time, this classification obscured the issues of class, poverty, and gender that also defined the murder. I'm happy to talk about Matthew Shepard later. It's complicated, more complicated than we thought it was a few years ago. Many in the United States are wedded to using hate to explain our personal interactions and political ideologies. Society has created a hate frame, a phrase we use often, in order to explain violence, to seek justice, and to attempt to understand human goodness. But what would it look like to disentangle hate from justice and replace the language of hate with that of goodness? Compare the Matthew Shepard case with the noted 2012 rape that took place in Steubenville, Ohio. On August 12, 2012, Trent Mays and Malek Richmond, two high school football players, were accused and convicted of sexually assaulting a highly intoxicated 16-year-old female student from a neighboring high school at a large, out-of-control party. Fellow students witnessed the assault, disseminated photos on social media, and openly discussed it. The mainstream media coverage was filled with outrage. Interestingly, the words hate and hate crime were never used. News reporting and commentary highlighted issues of teenage drinking, male sports culture, and the desensitizing impact of social media. And there was some media discussion of the prevalence of rape and sexual violence in the United States. There's also, if you remember, a great deal of worry that the boys were going to be punished too much. But almost no attempt was made to contextualize the assault in the example of a socially accepted hatred or animus towards women, which is almost always the case with rape and sexual assault. The language of hate, or its absence in this case, shapes how many individuals and institutions understand and order the world. It prioritizes events, actions, people, groups, and beliefs. It helps define the self in relationship to righteousness, fairness, and justice. Society labels certain crimes hate crimes because morally and legally it has decided that they were motivated by a clear animus towards a specific person or group, and it's legally, right, because of their religion, race, sexual orientation, gender expression, disability, or ethnicity. The mainstream media often asks, why did the 9/11 hijackers hate America? News stories describe anti-gay slurs in high school hallways as hate speech. Yet society does not generally define violence against women as motivated by hate. Nor do most people think of New York's, now being re-examined, New York's stop and frisk policing policy overwhelmingly aimed at young men of color as motivated by hate. What we want to do is examine what individuals and groups mean when they use the word hate. What are the personal, social, and cultural impacts and consequences of the language of hate? So what we really want to look at is how does hate work as a concept in American society? Ironically, considering hate is not in the end about hate at all. Hate is just an easy placeholder for a very complex web of many other concepts. Concepts that are integral to ideas of personhood, justice, fairness, and goodness. On a larger scale, they are the foundation of our understanding of society and culture. The hate frame provides a clear, quickly grasped, emotionally and psychically comfortable context. We can just slot right into it, right? Context in which to consider our inchoate and frequently unexamined ideas of what it means to be human, what it means to reflect goodness in our lives, and what it means to seek justice. Considering hate does not argue that people and groups cannot possess an animus directed, influenced by prejudice against and ignorance of others that often results in physical and emotionally damaging actions. I mean, history and contemporary life demonstrate that they can all the time. What we are arguing here is that the reflexive labeling of these emotions and actions as hate obscures the multiplicity of factors that help explain them. It also prevents people from understanding the complex ways in which they are structured. So I want to actually just skip a page. The hate frame prevents examination of many types of violence embedded in American culture, some of which are taken are accepted or taken for granted, some are not. It also prevents us from examining whom violence is directed against and why. Often violence is seen as spontaneous, such as with intimate partner domestic violence, which is always seen as just sort of an explosion. Sometimes it's seen as legitimate, such as police violence. In reality, such violence is structural. That is, it's embedded in cultural norms and is frequently unseen and unchallenged. These forms of violence are almost never labeled as expressions of hate, right? So we're looking at selective use. The selective use of the language of hate, in some cases reflecting a rush to judgment, and in others virtually never applied, obscures and purposely ignores social and cultural power relationships that may help us understand the cause of multiple forms of violence that we all live with. Only by understanding the actual causes of violence is it used to oppress a person or a group, to resist oppression, to assert independence, to assert control, can we begin to really understand what fairness and justice might mean in these situations. The larger question is, why do concepts of justice, fairness, and goodness coalesce around hate? Why has hate and its attendant violence and reliance on retribution, the criminal legal system and the prison system, become so central to American culture? Why is it important? Why are so many people fascinated, even obsessed with it? Daily news headlines warn that the slightest change in Middle Eastern politics, I just saw this on CNN 20 minutes ago, may produce a crisis of international terrorists. Since 1988, multiple versions of television's hugely popular Law and Order series, which thrive in reruns, impress on audiences the endless dangers of American life and the need to convict and imprison perpetrators. In the summer of 2013, during the Trayvon Martin murder trial, the nation was transfixed with the question whether George Zimmerman had created a hate crime. So I just want to skip to the later chapter. I felt writing the book with Kay that the first part of it was so overwhelmingly, I think, correct, but it felt very negative. So we had to come up with solutions to all of this. And of course, we didn't really have solutions because there are no easy solutions to it. In chapter 5, which is called Goodness in the Public Imagination, so we dwell on these two concepts, one of which comes from Walter Brueggemann, who's a theologian, called the prophetic imagination. And the two concepts that we have here, I just lost my page here, is transformative imagination and disruptive intelligence, which we can talk about during the question and answer period. The quote we begin, Goodness in the Public Imagination, is from Audre Lorde, the great Jamaican-American lesbian poet, cancer survivor, prophet. She said, that you can't fight City Hall is a rumor being spread by City Hall. I'm glad you left. I got some more water. It is impossible for society to move forward if it cannot first imagine a different and better future. Imagination, the ability to confront and remake reality by utilizing creative powers of mind and spirit, is an essential but undervalued political tool. It does not replace activism and community organizing, but inspires and animates it. It brings new analytical insights into being. It invigorates a new social understanding of goodness and moral agency. It brings these concepts symbolic meaning and changes the terms of public discourse and debate. At its most powerful, it challenges American culture to go beyond superficial reform that leaves the status quo intact. In The Prophetic Imagination, biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann argues that the imagination evokes the language of newness and radical hope, which is antithetical to the ethos of domination. So we have several case studies in the back of the book. I'll just read from one briefly and then we can do questions. People may know this study, although I'm surprised none of my students have ever heard of this. This is Chapter 5, The Death of Amy Beale. People know the Amy Beale story? The transformative possibilities of imagination can also be seen in what happened in 1993 and beyond in a black township in Cape Town, South Africa. In late summer, Amy Beale, a 26-year-old white American Fulbright scholar studying the role of women in transitional regimes, was driving several black colleagues to their homes. An active supporter of the African National Congress, She worked with the black-led resistance to the violence of South Africa's institutionalized racism. As Beale slowly motored her way through the area, an angry crowd formed, throwing stones and shouting anti-white slogans. In the mob's mind, Amy embodied the very real brutality of white Afrikaner rule. A brick hit the car's windshield, the car stopped, and Amy Beale was stoned and stabbed to death. The violence occurred in the dying days of the white Afrikaner apartheid. In 1990, after Nelson Mandela was released from prison, new elections were scheduled to be held the following year. Even with change on the horizon, South African blacks remained at the mercy of the apartheid regime. Between Mandela's release and his subsequent election as president 4 years later, over 10,000 people, most of them black, died as a result of state-sponsored violence. 4 young South African men were convicted of Amy Beale's murder and sent to prison. Several years into their sentences, they appeared before the post-apartheid Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This government body, established by the South African Parliament in 1995, oversaw a transitional justice process to address the massive human rights abuses of apartheid. The men who killed Beale petitioned for amnesty. Despite their grief, Linda and Peter Beale, Amy's parents, supported the petition. The men were released in 1998. Despite its many limitations, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission sought to embody the imagination necessary to envision an alternative to vengeance. Beale's parents shared this vision, honoring Amy's humanity, even as they refused to lose sight of the humanity of those who killed her. This expression of goodness held the potential for transformation. In 1994, Amy's parents had established the nonprofit Amy Beale Foundation to serve children of the impoverished townships of the Western Cape. A related expression of goodness was made by 2 of the young men, Ese Nofamela and Nakobo Penny, both just 19 years old when they killed Amy. Following their release from prison, Nofama and Penny joined the Amy Beale Foundation staff. This organization now provides after-school programs and opportunities, HIV/AIDS peer education, literacy, music and performative arts, sports and environmental activities, crucial to helping young girls and boys in the Western Cape create better futures by helping them understand themselves as good, talented, responsible people and members of a larger community. The murder of Amy Beale and its aftermath contradict the hate frame in multiple ways. One person is murdered. 4 other people whose lives are forever linked to her collide in horrific circumstances. Those 4 people come to recognize one another as worthy human beings. The violence of apartheid, the structural violence of apartheid, right, touches each of them in different but interdependent ways. Refusing to compete for primary victim status or the righteousness of a particular animus, they understand the nature of the violence that engulfs them, and they assume responsibility for what happens next. In time, they transform themselves and one another. The outcome of this one story did not solve the injustices that continued in post-apartheid South Africa, nor did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission produce justice for all. Nelson Mandela's presidency and subsequent black-led administration could not, in a relatively short time, substantially dismantle the historically entrenched culture of violence. Though the formal structure of apartheid is gone and many important changes have been enacted, economic power still remains largely in white hands. Black poverty remains widespread, violence has not disappeared. Nonetheless, as these events demonstrate, mandates for vengeance can be transformed into practices that strengthen communities instead of tearing them apart. This is not done by somebody else, but it is up to us, the ordinary people. Permitting those already in charge to determine the terms of debate will never produce real change. So I'll stop there. If you want to do questions, and my voice is giving out. Thank you.
To me, there's a lot of white male entitlement in this country, which is manifest in the Senate. Congress right now.
It is,
And
yes,
they-
yes.
They,
It has been for a
feel
while.
as long as they have theirs, you know, to
Yeah.
hell with everybody else, you know. The American way is to take care of yourself, and if you can't, too bad.
Right, and certainly, you know, I went to high school, school in the 50s where, you know, what's good for American business is good for America. You know, we have I mean, we can easily blame it on white men, not even white straight men, but white men in general. We can blame it on capitalism. You know, I think what we try to do in the book is, right, is to really sort of unpack this a little bit more. I mean, I think that's a great place to sort of begin. But I think part of it is people sort of, on a community level, because one thing we talk about at the end of the book is really talking about community activism on a very grassroots level, and people taking responsibility for their own lives, which we saw a little bit in Ferguson and in New York with the marches, I think. Does that sort of answer the question for people?
Well, I think too, we have a lot of different cultures here, and there's a lot of clash of ideas.
Right, which we see in Europe happens when there are those different cultures coming in. Certainly in like France, right? And history of like colonialism, which we have here in a different way. I mean, I think what surprises me is how, you know, we tried to indicate in the beginning for the book, right, that hatred is just, we all feel hatred, or we all feel animus, or we all feel reactions to things that we label hate. I mean, certainly I've been, although I'm at Harvard now for years, I worked up at Dartmouth College, where we have a very strong fraternity Greek system, a terrible problem with, I mean, with sexual assault and with rape, but also with homophobic assaults, with racist assaults. I mean, there was an article last year where a black woman student was literally called the N-word walking across campus at night by these white students. What surprises me about my own reaction is that, you know, I go around saying, I hate Dartmouth, I hate these people, I hate these students, I hate, you know, and what I realize that what I need to look at, right, is like, how do I deal with that in the classroom, besides saying, you know, attacking frats, as part of my lecture, which I try not to do. You know, but really, I mean, how is the faculty that has voted, and this is just one little example, how is the faculty which has actually voted about 5 times to abolish the Greek system complicit somehow with the system, with actually not offering alternatives, with actually not actually offering these, you know, because they join Greek houses because they're afraid to be alone, they're lonely, and, you know, and yet they're like white guys, some of whom are privileged, some of whom don't, because we have a lot of money to give out to poor students who want to join frats as well. You know, so I think that for me, what really surprised me was actually questioning my own reactions to things. You know, because we said the one thing, right, oh, I hate that, meaning escargot or some sort of food, right? But in fact, we all have emotionally violent reactions to a number of things. And also what surprised me in writing the book, right, was that really trying to figure out, and we touched on this a little bit, I wish we went more, but we didn't write a 600-page book, right? Sometimes violence may be necessary. I mean, if you look at country, I'm thinking particularly of colonial Africa, right? None of those countries would be free without violence. You know, there's a great essay by Jean Genet that hardly reproduced anywhere, where he talks about there's a real difference between violence and brutality. And he argues in his very Jean Genet way, right, that violence is the chick pecking out of the egg, it's the seed breaking through the ground, it's some disruption of nature. Brutality is when somebody oppresses you, when the police, you know, so I mean, there's a lot of my own, as somebody who was a prison abolitionist and who's always been, you know, who was like really badly picked on in grammar school and high school, and I hate those people. Yeah, I still want to kill Bernie Fitzgerald. Kind of, I do. You know, I think the hardest thing for me was actually thinking about my own reactions to all these things, and in a really serious way.
What do you mean by the hate frame?
By the hate frame, I need a sip of water, is the hate frame, which is really Kay Whitlock's term that she's been using. It is simply a frame as a way of looking at the world, right? So we exist in this world, good things happen, goodness, justice, fairness, bad things happen, right? And what we have is that we are all completely, seduced into thinking a certain way. So we can actually, you know, the example that we use in the book, which I sort of hesitate reading about, but I'll bring it up here, is the marathon bombings in Boston. And when was that? 2013? 2012? 13. Was it 13? Right. You know, and they happened. I mean, a terrible, terrible thing. 4 people were killed, 260 people were injured, right? And the media immediately, knowing nothing, right, said 9/11 terrorists. You know, nobody said Oklahoma City, right wing, whatever. There's, what's the word? The people who live on little parts of land. Militants, but anyway, the right wing, and then it turns out that in fact the story was very complicated. They were Chechen brothers. They were Muslim. One of them had been interviewed by the FBI. You know, one of them was a beloved athlete. They were very assimilated into America. So by sort of the hate frame is just any immediate response we have to sort of explain it, to have it make sense quickly. I mean, it's sort of like watching a movie. You watch a movie and suddenly someone just says, "Oh, the villain," you know, and it's a great movie, right, when that twists at the end. But most don't, right? Most just, you say, that's it, this explains it all. So the hate frame is just a real, it's a frame that makes the world comfortable for us. And, you know, and sometimes it's right. I mean, sometimes it's half right, sometimes it's sort of right. I would say almost always it doesn't explain enough, and it doesn't actually push us to think. And it certainly doesn't push us to think about larger concepts and, you know, this sort of prophetic imagination. And I must say part of what inspired our writing the book was the Norton, when Toni Morrison was here. Yeah. Was the Norton lectures, the Eliot lectures? Yeah. You know, and she really interrogated the notion of what goodness meant in America. And, you know, and Toni Morrison, quite completely brilliant, right, really talked about that in 19th century American novels, there was much more goodness. Once we get to World War II and the horrors of Hiroshima, the horrors of the Holocaust, American literature really becomes obsessed with finding who's bad, finding who's guilty, and slugging that into this very determined thing. You know, if you go back to Dreiser, if you go back, or in Europe, you go back to Dickens, right? It's just much more. It's muddier. It's more thoughtful.
I'm curious about Steubenville and hate,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I was trained, and maybe it was in the 80s, that sexual assault and sexual violence, misogyny was at the root.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not a common. I guess that's not a common frame that people would say is a hate crime. And why isn't it?
Well, actually, this is really interesting. In almost all the states that have hate crime laws, rape could be prosecuted as a hate crime, because gender is included, right? It almost never is. So prosecutors could actually easily say hate crime, add another 15 years onto the sentence, right? I think, to back to what you said earlier, I think part of this is that who would go to prison for rape? Would it be heterosexual men across the board, mostly? I mean, some exceptions of male-on-male rape. And often male-on-male rape in prison is actually self-identified heterosexuals. You know, I think we have an aversion to looking at causes. I think people, I mean, clearly we've all, I hope, although we haven't really, moved to, you know, the woman that was in the Steubenville, right? Well, she was really drunk. She was out of control. She, you know, I mean, people literally on CNN, and they were called on, right? There were 2 reporters on CNN, one of whom was Frederica, I forget her last name. You know, they went on at length about, well, if they go to prison, they're only 18 or 19, or they're 17 or 18 or 16, that they'll be in prison for 20 years. That's really unfair. They said they were sorry, you know.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, and in fact, they went to a juvenile prison for, I think, a year, and now they're back playing football. And I'm not, you know, I'm not in favor of people going to, you know, this comes up in some of my daughter's classes where we talk about sexual assault on campus. And the general feeling is, from many of the women students, is somebody does it and is convicted and it's not unclear, they should go to prison. And I say for 20 years, and they say, well, that's a sentence. And I say, all right, so they're young men in prison, and they'll be sexually assaulted on a weekly basis.
Just what they deserve.
For the next 20 years. Well, and some students say just what they deserve, and other students say, well, maybe they shouldn't go to prison. Then there's the question of what should happen to them. Should they be under house arrest? Should they go to prison for 5 years? I mean, I think these are really complicated structural problems with the, Kay had this phrase, and her co-authors from the first book had this phrase, that they don't say the criminal justice system, it's the criminal legal system, because there's barely any justice in it for many, many people. Although it is a legal system, right? I think we don't want to say, it's like, we don't call rape a hate crime because the hate crime would say that it is really bad, and this is either, the worst is, she was drunk or she was wearing a short skirt, or they were both drunk, or what do you expect? Yep, he really reacted badly, but this is a complicated situation. Something that we never say about terrorism. It's never a complicated situation when clearly it's a really complicated situation. And I think we're afraid to look at like root structural causes because it means looking at things in a very serious way.
And if something is classified as a rape, as a hate crime, what has to be demonstrated legally? It's basically that he didn't just beat up this guy with a baseball bat because he was just a guy. He beat up the guy with a baseball bat because he was South Asian or because he was a Muslim. He had, some particular prejudicial animus.
Yeah.
So I mean, the category of women's pretty broad there. So it's
right.
It's hard to. It's so broad and so deeply prejudicial that it's hard to sort of pluck it out and say, oh, well, yeah, it's rape because he really can't stand women.
Right.
Yeah.
So to go back, most states do include gender, so it could be prosecuted, right?
Yeah.
So one of the salient parts of most hate crime laws is that there has to be an articulated animus.
Articulated animus.
So you have to say, you fag, you N-word, So years ago, 14 years ago, I was mugged on Putnam Avenue where I lived, right? And they held a knife to my, they weren't going to hurt me, they just wanted my paltry $20 that was in my wallet. Yeah. So if they had actually said you fag, and if they had been caught, right? If they had been caught and sent to prison, they would have been maybe 7 years for armed robbery, on a reduced sentence. If they had said you're a fag, that would have actually been doubled. So there has to be an articulated animus. So I guess you could argue that if you say you bitch as someone's being raped, that you could have that, right? There are cases that are becoming more sort of prevalent where the animus doesn't have to be as articulated as that. So if you actually purposely go into a Latino neighborhood to beat somebody up, you don't have to say you beaner. There's a famous case quote in Patron Island where these four white and one African American teenager went into Latino neighborhoods that was called beaner bopping, where they'd have to go in and beat up Latino men, right? But with women, I think, so to really, to take it to the extreme, if you actually prosecuted all violence against women as a hate crime, it would completely disrupt our fundamental thinking, not to mention the legal system. And what, could we do that? Sure, I guess we could. People wouldn't go along with it, you could have activist judges doing it. But it is very interesting, right, that you can prosecute rape under hate crime laws and nobody ever does. I think it's very telling. And it's right, it's like, race, ethnicity, religion, and gender. And sexual orientation, and also now gender appearance, which protects transgender people who were not protected before that, right?
It just seems to me there are so many people in the American society that are taking time off because there's so much frustration in our society because there's so much inequality and so much accepted violence, like raping of women and abusing of children. It just goes down to the next weaker person. That's all it is.
It does.
It's a frustrated person who takes it on someone who he feels he can overpower. And it's usually a he.
And it's usually he.
But usually.
Yeah.
Right? So it's just a lot of frustrated people. So I think what we need to do in the society is take away a lot of that frustration by having it more of an equal society, taking care more of people's needs, like the mentally ill, like the poor, like single mothers. Like just having more reasonable childcare costs. So many things we could change in the society to make people less frustrated.
We could, but you actually have an analysis that's a structural analysis of what's wrong with America. Most people don't. And then the question would be, who would pay for more childcare? Who would pay for community colleges? Who would,
Well, we stop sending people to Afghanistan and Iraq and,
Sure.
and Vietnam and all these other places we don't need to send people. We have the money for it.
Yeah. Right, but that's, I completely agree. I think we're not there yet.
I was thinking that hate and justice have a correlation. And it seems to me that people hate when they're subjected to something they consider to be unjust and to which they don't have any remedy, to which they have to remain silent, so that their hate increases because the injustice is unaddressed. Is that?
I think that's right. And the one thing that we speak about in the book is hate, what the hate frame does, right? The hate frame actually institutes these cycles of violence. You know, and it's interesting, right, that in fact, most people see themselves not as haters, although they're happy to go there if they need to, right? Or if they don't need to, but if they feel that they have to. But they see themselves as like being hated, right? So if you look at the American legal system or the American justice, right? I mean, people think, well, and you know, if you read a book like Angela Davis's "Are Prisons Obsolete?" right, where she just documents that there's just the prison and now privatized. So companies are making money out of prisons. It's not the government, with the old image of 30s movies with license plates being made, right? If you actually begin to recycle people and then they come out of prison, then they can't vote and they can't get jobs and they can't, you know, that it just recreates the cycle again and again. And, you know, and of course, those people, white or black, are going to be disenfranchised and are going to hate the people that did it to them and are going to act possibly in violent ways, which will put them back in prison. But I think what we need is to look at some form of justice that is not simply. So I mean, one thing the book comes at. It's a small part of the book, right? But we actually come out against hate crime legislation because one, it actually there's no study at all shows that it actually stops violence against gay people or women or communities of color. There's just no. It's like the death penalty studies, right? It just doesn't stop crime. And secondly, I think what it does really well is that it actually gives people a real sense of power, which could be called vengeance. Yeah, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, right? And but I mean, vengeance it's great. I really want to kill Bernie Fitzgerald for harassing me in high school, and that was like a while ago, like 1964. That's like 50 years or 40 years.
54.
50 years.
Yeah, I'm sure your math is wrong.
Try 60.
Yeah. You know, so that if we have 60. It's right. I have a phone in my pocket. We can do it later. If we actually have a justice system that is actually predicated, you know, on some form of retribution, it's just not going to solve anything. I mean, what I love about the Amy Beale story is that it's almost a parable and it's wonderful. It's obviously not going to happen all over the world. And you know, as you point out, right, it's great. And the South African tribunals really worked to a large degree, but they didn't solve everything. That in fact, the structural violence of apartheid is going to, the after effects, the aftershocks are going to go on for another 100 years. There's just no way to undo that much history. I mean, we're still talking about, do we have terrorism now because of the Crusades? And what year were the Crusades? Yeah, like a long time ago. Before I was in high school. Way before I was in high school. Luckily. You know, so when we talk about, but I think vengeance is, you know, and the reality, right, if you look at hate crime laws, that almost every gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer organization supports them. The NAACP supports them. You know, they don't work. There's no evidence that they work, and yet they really give people. I was talking to Lillian Faderman, who's a world-renowned historian of women's history and gay and lesbian history, and she was saying, I don't support the hate crime laws, but you know what? She wrote this book on queer history since 1945. She said everybody I spoke to said it made them feel really good that gay and lesbian people were finally included in hate crime laws because they mattered. And that's hard to argue against. I mean, you can argue against by saying, one, it doesn't work, two, it puts you in more danger, three, it doesn't, it's hard enough to feel good in a world that's riddled with violence, as you pointed out, riddled with inequalities, and riddled with all kinds of things. And that makes people feel good, and it's not a solution.
That they're hated too.
Yeah, they're hated too, right? And actually, right. But that's sort of the cycle, right? Is that if you're hated, you're including these laws, and if you're including these laws, then you're somebody. Then what Lillian said was that the one thing people were saying was the government cared enough, and the government hardly cares about anybody really, but the government cared enough to put us in these laws.
Like you, I oppose hate crime legislation. And I do think there's much more to the Matthew Shepard case than we as queers have made it out to be for understandable reasons over the years. But I'm having trouble, not having read the book, just thinking about what you've been saying tonight, quite fitting what you're saying to the case of straight men hating gay men. I've spent the last 15 years traveling around the country doing queer education, especially in the Deep South. And when I experience, when I see that, it doesn't feel to me, obviously, like vengeance on the part of straight men. It doesn't feel like a statement against those traditionally in power. There's a visceral disgust. I mean, obviously, for many straight men, the proximate sight, or even on the movie screen, of two men kissing, what they prompts what they would call hate. How do you deal with that, especially as a gay man yourself? Would you use another word like visceral disgust, or? Just curious. It feels like a different case in some ways.
Yeah, so in chapter 2.
Yes, I must have dealt with this. I just couldn't.
We do address that, right? So we live. I mean, both in Europe, but we deal with them like most America, right? That there's a long history of eugenics laws, freak shows, the way we treat people, the way we use disgust, and this is what Martha Nussbaum writes so brilliantly about in her book Disgust. And but also what if you know Mary Douglas? I always said Mary Daly. Mary Douglas, his book Purity and Danger, right? That there are, which is all totally constructed disgust, right? I mean, Martha Nussbaum talks about the fact that there are these experiments where people in the experiment are given a bedpan, completely wrapped in plastic, never been used, and asked to drink water from it, and they can't do it. They just cannot do it because it's disgusting, right? So, but I think that disgust is culturally and socially constructed, right? But does it have to lead to violence? Does it have to lead to these, to like homophobic violence of these heterosexual men? It doesn't have to, right? But everything is being lined up that it's going to lead that way because that violence is actually acceptable. There's an essay by Pat Califia, who's now Patrick Califia, where when he was she said, we have these cases in men's bathrooms of a gay man comes up to a straight man and doesn't touch him, but makes some sort of indication that something might happen, and is horribly beaten up, right? And the violence is always on the approach. The police say, well, he caused, he did, The violence is never on the fact that, in fact, the gay man was then brutally beaten, right? So it's how we think about the structures, how we think about hate, how we actually think about the very notions about disgust. And, I mean, in most cases, a no thank you would be fine. But what's excusable in the culture, right, is excusing the violence, because that reinforces the disgust that's important to people's self-identities.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you all.